Welcome, everyone, to episode 91 of Ohio Unsolved. I'm your host, Matthew, and this is the 2-year anniversary episode of the podcast. There are no words that I can think of to appropriately thank everyone for their continued support over these last 2 years. Whether you've been here since the very first episode, or this is your first time listening, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Doing this podcast full-time is my ultimate goal, and while I'm not there yet, I know that I will be. I've got a Patreon that has monthly bonus episodes, and once I get to the point where I can do this podcast full-time, I'm going to upload weekly bonus episodes, so that'll be 2 episodes per week, 1 bonus and 1 regular. Now, my original idea for the anniversary episode was to make it all about you, the listeners. But sadly, I didn't get any emails from anyone willing to share their story. The one email I got, they never responded with their story. So I chose something pretty interesting. So let's just get right into the episode. Everyone sit back, make sure to lock your doors and windows, and get ready for Ohio Unsolved. Charles Manson was an American criminal, cult leader, and musician who led the Manson family, a cult based in California in the late 1960s. Some of the members committed a series of at least 9 murders at 4 different locations in July and August 1969. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of 7 people, including the actress Sharon Tate. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the murders, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. Before the murders, Manson had spent more than half of his life in correctional institutions. While gathering his cult following, Manson was a singer and songwriter on the fringe of the Los Angeles music industry, chiefly through a chance association with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, who introduced Manson to record producer Terry Melcher. In 1968, the Beach Boys recorded Manson's song Cease to Exist, renamed Never Learn Not to Love, as a single B-side, but without a credit to Manson. Afterward, Manson attempted to secure a record contract through Melcher, but he was unsuccessful. Manson would often talk about the Beatles, including their 1968 album. According to Los Angeles County District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi, Manson felt guided by his interpretation of the Beatles' lyrics and adopted the term helter-skelter to describe an impending apocalyptic race war. During his trial, Bugliosi argued that Manson had intended to start a race war, although Manson and others disputed this. Contemporary interviews and trial witness testimony insisted that the Tate-LaBianca murders were copycat crimes intended to exonerate Manson's friend Bobby Boselli. I butchered that name. Boselli Manson himself denied having instructed anyone to murder anyone. Charles Manson was born on November 12, 1934, to 15-year-old Ada Kathleen Maddox of Ashland, Kentucky, in the University of Cincinnati Academic Health Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. Manson's biological father appears to have been Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr. of Cattlesburg, Kentucky, against whom Maddox filed a paternity suit that resulted in an agreed judgment in 1937. Scott worked intermittently in local mills and had a long local reputation as a con artist. He allowed Maddox to believe that he was an Army colonel, although colonel was merely his given name. When Maddox told Scott that she was pregnant, he informed her that he had been called away on Army business. After several months, she realized that he had no intention of returning. Manson never knew his biological father. In August 1934, before Manson's birth, Maddox married William Eugene Manson, a laborer at a dry cleaning business. Maddox often went on drinking sprees with her brother Luther Elbert Maddox, leaving Charles with babysitters. Maddox and Manson divorced on April 30th, 1937, after William alleged gross neglect of duty by Maddox. Charles retained William's last name, Manson. On August 1st, 1939, Luther and Kathleen Maddox were arrested for assault and robbery. Kathleen and Luther were sentenced to 5 and 10 years of imprisonment, respectively. Charles Manson was placed in the home of an aunt and uncle in McMean, West Virginia. His mother was paroled in 1942. Manson later characterized the first weeks after she returned from prison as the happiest time in his life. Weeks after Maddox's release, Manson's family moved to Charleston, West Virginia, where Manson continually played truant and his mother spent her evenings drinking. She was arrested for grand larceny but not convicted. The family later moved to Indianapolis, where Maddox met alcoholic Lewis Woodson Cavender Jr. through Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and married him in August of 1943. In an interview with Diane Sawyer, Charles Manson said that when he was 9, he set his school on fire. He also got in trouble for truancy and petty theft, although there was a lack of foster home placements. In 1947, at the age of 13, Manson was placed in the Gibaut School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, a school for male delinquents run by Catholic priests. Gibaut was a strict school where punishment for even the smallest infraction included beatings with either a wooden paddle or a leather strap. Manson ran away from the school and slept in the woods, under bridges, and wherever else he could find shelter. Charles Manson fled home to his mother and spent Christmas 1947 in McMean, West Virginia, at his aunt and uncle's house. His mother returned him to school. 10 months later, he ran away to Indianapolis. In 1948, in Indianapolis, Manson committed his first known crime by robbing a grocery store. At first, the robbery was simply to find something to eat. However, Manson found a cigar box containing just over $100 and he took the money. He used the money to rent a room on Indianapolis's Skid Row and to buy food. For a time, Manson had a job delivering messages for Western Union in an attempt to live a life free of crime. However, he quickly began to supplement his wages through petty theft. He was eventually caught, and in 1949, a sympathetic judge sent him to Boys Town, a juvenile facility in Omaha, Nebraska. After 4 days at Boys Town, he and fellow student Blackie Nielsen obtained a gun and stole a car. They used it to commit 2 armed robberies on their way to the home of Nielsen's uncle in Peoria, Illinois. Nielsen's uncle was a professional thief, and when the boys arrived, he allegedly took them on as apprentices. Manson was arrested 2 weeks later during a nighttime raid on a Peoria store. In the investigation that followed, he was linked to his 2 earlier armed robberies. He was sent to the Indiana Boys School, a strict reform school. At the school, other students allegedly raped Manson with the encouragement of a staff member, and he was repeatedly beaten. He ran away from the school 18 times. While at the school, Manson developed a self-defense technique he later called the insane game. When he was physically unable to defend himself, he would screech, grimace, and wave his arms to convince aggressors that he was insane. After a number of failed attempts, he escaped with 2 other boys in February of 1951. The 3 escapees were robbing filling stations while attempting to drive to California in stolen cars when they were arrested in Utah. For the federal crime of driving a stolen car across state lines, Manson was sent to Washington, D.C.'s National Training School for Boys. On arrival, he was given aptitude tests, which determined that he was illiterate, but had an above-average IQ of 109. His caseworker deemed him aggressively antisocial. On a psychiatrist's recommendation, Manson was transferred in October 1951 to Natural Bridge Honor Camp, a minimum security institution. His aunt visited him and told administrators that she would let him stay at her house and would help him find work. Manson had a parole hearing scheduled for February 1952. However, in January, he was caught raping a boy at knife point. Manson was then transferred to the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. There, he committed a further 8 serious disciplinary offenses, 3 involving homosexual acts. He was then moved to a maximum security reformatory at Chillicothe, Ohio, where he was expected to remain until his release on his 21st birthday in November 1955. Good behavior led to an early release in May of '54 to live with his aunt and uncle in McMean. In January 1955, Manson married a hospital waitress named Rosalie Jean Willis. Around October, about 3 months after he and his pregnant wife arrived in Los Angeles in a car that he had stolen in Ohio, Manson was again charged with a federal crime for taking the vehicle across state lines. After a psychiatric evaluation, he was given 5 years probation. Manson's failure to appear at a Los Angeles hearing on an identical charge filed in Florida resulted in his March 1956 arrest in Indianapolis. His probation was revoked, and he was sentenced to 3 years at Terminal Island in Los Angeles. While Manson was in prison, Rosalie gave birth to their son, Charles Manson Jr. During his first year at Terminal Island, Manson received visits from Rosalie and his mother, who were now living together in L.A. In March 1957, when the visits from his wife stopped, his mother informed him Rosalie was living with another man. Less than 2 weeks before a scheduled parole hearing, Manson tried to escape by stealing a car. He was given 5 years probation, and his parole was denied. Manson received 5 years parole in September 1958, the same year in which Rosalie received a decree of divorce. By November, he was pimping a 16-year-old girl and was receiving additional support from a girl with wealthy parents. In September 1959, he pled guilty to a charge of attempting to cash a forged U.S. Treasury check, which he claimed to have stolen from a mailbox. The latter charge was later dropped. He received a 10-year suspended sentence and probation after a young woman named Leona Ray Stevens, who had an arrest record for prostitution, made a tearful plea before the court that she and Manson were deeply in love and would marry if Charlie were freed. Before the year's end, the woman did marry Charles Manson, possibly so she would not be required to testify against him. Manson took Leona and another woman to New Mexico for purposes of prostitution, resulting in him being held and questioned for violating the Mann Act. Though he was released, Manson correctly suspected that the investigation had not ended. When he disappeared in violation of his probation, a bench warrant was issued. An indictment for violation of the Mann Act followed in April 1960. Following the arrest of one of the women for prostitution, Manson was arrested in June in Laredo, Texas, and was returned to L.A. For violating his probation on the check cashing charge, he was ordered to serve his 10-year sentence. Manson spent a year trying unsuccessfully to appeal the revocation of his probation. In July of 1961, he was transferred from the Los Angeles County Jail to the United States Penitentiary at McNeil Island, Washington. There, he took guitar lessons from Barker Karpus, gang leader Alvin Creepy Karpus, and obtained from another inmate a contact name of someone at Universal Studios in Hollywood, Phil Kaufman. Among his fellow prisoners during this time was Danny Trejo, who participated in several hypnosis sessions. Manson's mother moved to Washington State to be closer to him during his McNeil Island incarceration, working nearby as a waitress. Although the Mann Act charge had been dropped, the attempt to cash the Treasury check was still a federal offense. Manson's September 1961 annual review noted he had a, quote, tremendous drive to call attention to himself, an observation echoed in September 1964. In 1963, Leona was granted a divorce. During the process, she alleged that she and Manson had a son, Charles Luther Manson. According to a popular urban legend, Manson auditioned unsuccessfully for the Monkees in late 1965. This is refuted by the fact that Manson was still incarcerated at McNeil Island at that time. In June 1966, Charles Manson was sent for the second time to Terminal Island in preparation for early release. By the time of his release day on March 21, 1967, he had spent more than half of his 32 years in prisons and other institutions. This was mainly because he had broken federal laws. Federal sentences were and remain much more severe than state sentences for many of the same offenses. Telling the authorities that prison had become his home, he requested permission to stay. Less than a month after his 1967 release from prison, Manson moved to Berkeley from L.A., which could have been a probation violation. Instead, after calling the San Francisco probation office upon his arrival, he was transferred to the supervision of criminology doctoral researcher and federal probation officer Roger Smith. Until the spring of 1968, Smith worked at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which Manson and his family frequented throughout their stay in the Haight. Roger Smith, as well as the HAFMC's founder David Smith, received funding from the National Institutes of Health and reportedly the CIA to study the effects of drugs like LSD and methamphetamine on the counterculture movement in Haight-Ashbury. The patients at the clinic became subjects of their research, including Manson and his expanding group of mostly female followers, who came to see Roger Smith regularly. Manson received permission from Roger Smith to move from Berkeley to the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco. He first took LSD and would use it frequently during his time there. David Smith, who had studied the effects of LSD and amphetamines in rodents, wrote that the change in Manson's personality during this time, quote, was the most abrupt Roger Smith had observed in his entire professional career. Manson also read the book Stranger in a Strange Land, a science fiction novel by Robert Anton Heinlein, inspired by the burgeoning free love philosophy in Haight-Ashbury during the Summer of Love. Manson began preaching his own philosophy based on a mixture of Stranger in a Strange Land, the Bible, Scientology, Dale Carnegie, and the Beatles, which quickly earned him a following. Manson began studying Scientology while incarcerated with the help of fellow inmate Lanier Rayner, and in July 1961, Manson listed his religion as Scientology. A September 1961 prison report argues that Manson, quote, appears to have developed a certain amount of insight into his problems through his study of this discipline. Another prison report in August of 1966 stated that Manson was no longer an advocate of Scientology. Upon his release in 1967, Manson traveled to LA, where he reportedly met local Scientologists and attended several parties for movie stars. Manson completed 150 hours of auditing. Manson's, quote, right-hand man, Bruce Davis, worked at the Church of Scientology headquarters in London from November 1968 to April 1969. Following his release from prison on March 22, 1967, Charles Manson moved to San Francisco, where, with the help of a prison acquaintance, he moved into an apartment in Berkeley. In prison, bank robber Alvin Karpis had taught Manson to play the steel guitar. Living mostly by begging, Manson soon became acquainted with Mary Bruner, a 23-year-old graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Bruner was working as a library assistant at the University of California, Berkeley, and Manson moved in with her. He then met Lynette Fromm, later nicknamed Squeaky, a runaway teen, and convinced her to live with him and Bruner. According to a second-hand account, Manson overcame Bruner's initial resistance to him bringing other women in to live with them. Before long, they were sharing Bruner's residence with 18 other women. Manson targeted individuals for manipulation who were emotionally insecure and social outcasts. Manson established himself as a guru in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, which, during the Summer of Love, was emerging as the signature hippie locale. Manson may have borrowed some of his philosophy from the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Its members believed Satan would become reconciled to Jesus, and they would come together at the end of the world to judge humanity. Manson soon had the first of his group of followers, most of them female. They were later dubbed as the Manson family by Los Angeles prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi in the media. Manson allegedly taught his followers that they were the reincarnation of the original Christians, and that the establishment could be characterized as the Romans. Sometime around 1967, he began using the alias Charles Willis Manson. Before the end of summer, Manson and some of the women began traveling in an old-school bus that they had adapted, putting colored rugs and pillows in place of the many seats that they had removed. They eventually settled in the Los Angeles areas of Topanga Canyon, Malibu, and Venice along the coast. In 1967, Bruner became pregnant by Manson. On April 15, 1968, she gave birth to their son, whom she named Valentine Michael, in a condemned house where they were living in Topanga Canyon. She was assisted by several of the young women from the family. Bruner, like most members of the group, acquired a number of aliases and nicknames, including Mariochi, Ouch, Mother of Mary, Mary Manson, Linda D. Manson, and Christine Marie Ukes. In his book, Love Needs Care, about his time at the HAFMC, David Smith claimed that Manson attempted to reprogram his followers' minds to, quote, submit totally to his will through the use of LSD and unconventional sexual practices that would turn his followers into empty vessels that would accept anything he poured. Manson family member Paul Watkins testified that Manson would encourage group LSD trips and take lower doses himself to keep his wits about him. Watkins said that Charlie's trip was to program us all to submit. By the end of his stay in the Height in April of 1968, Manson had attracted 20 or so followers, all under the supervision of his parole officer Roger Smith and many of the staff at the HAFMC. The core members of Manson's following eventually included Charles Tex Watson, a musician and former actor, Bobby Bossellini, a former musician and pornographic actor, Bruner, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. Supervised by his parole officer Roger Smith, Manson grew his family through drug use and prostitution without interference from the authorities. Manson was arrested on July 31, 1967, for attempting to prevent the arrest of one of his followers, Ruth Ann Morehouse. Instead of Manson being sent back to prison, the charge was reduced to a misdemeanor, and Manson was given 3 additional years of probation. He avoided prosecution again in July of 1968, when he and the family were arrested while moving from San Francisco to Los Angeles with the permission of Roger Smith, when his bus crashed into a ditch where Manson and members of his family, including Bruner and Manson's newborn baby, were found sleeping naked by the police. Afterwards, he was again arrested and released only a few days later, this time on a drug charge. Manson established a base for the family at the Spahn Ranch in August 1968, after Wilson's landlord evicted them. It had been a television and movie set for westerns, but the buildings had deteriorated by the late 1960s. The ranch then derived revenue primarily from selling horseback rides. Female family members did chores around the ranch and occasionally had sex on Manson's orders with the nearly blind 80-year-old owner George Spahn. The women also acted as guides for him. In exchange, Spahn allowed Manson and his group to live at the ranch for free. The Manson family developed into a doomsday cult when Manson became fixated on the idea of an imminent apocalyptic race war between America's black population and the larger white population. A white supremacist, Manson told some of the Manson family that black people in America would rise up and kill all white people except for Manson and his family, but that they were not intelligent enough to survive on their own. They would need a white man to lead them, and so they would serve Manson as their master. According to Vincent, I'm always going to mispronounce this guy's name, Buglossi, in late 1968, Manson adopted the term Helter Skelter, taken from a song the Beatles recently released, White Album, to refer to this upcoming war. On March 23, 1969, Manson entered the grounds of 1050 Celio Drive, which he had known as Melcher's residence. He was not invited. As he approached the main house, Manson was met by I'm going to butcher this name too. Sharoka Hatami, Hatami, an Iranian photographer who had befriended film director Roman Polanski and his wife Sharon Tate during the making of the documentary Mia and Roman. He was there to photograph Tate before she departed for Rome the following day. Seeing Manson approach, Hatami had gone onto the front porch to ask him what he wanted. Manson said that he was looking for Melcher, whose name Hatami did not recognize. She then told him the place where Polanski was the Polanski residence, and then advised him to try the path to the guest house beyond the main house. Tate appeared behind Hatami in the house's front door and asked him who was calling. Hatami and Tate maintained their positions while Manson went back to the guest house without a word, returned to the front a minute or two later, and left. That evening, Manson returned to the property and again went to the guest house. He entered the enclosed porch and spoke with Altobelli, the owner, who had just come out of the shower. Manson asked for Melcher, but Altobelli felt that Manson was actually looking for him. It was later discovered that Manson had apparently been to the property on earlier occasions after Melcher left. Altobelli told Manson through the screen door that Melcher had moved to Malibu, and said that he did not know his new address, although he did. Altobelli told Manson that he was leaving the country the next day, and Manson said he would like to speak with him upon his return. Altobelli said that he would be gone for more than a year. Manson said that he had been directed to the guest house by the persons in the main house. Altobelli asked Manson not to disturb his tenants. Altobelli and Tate flew together to Rome the next day. Tate asked him whether that creepy-looking guy had gone to see him at the guest house the day before. On the night of August 8th, 1969, Tex Watson took Susan Atkins, Linda Casbian, and Patricia Krenwinkel back to the house in Benedict Canyon. Watson later claimed that Manson had instructed him to go to the house and, quote, totally destroy everyone in it, and to do it as gruesome as you can. Manson told the women to do as Watson instructed them. The occupants of the house at Celio Drive that evening were 26-year-old movie actress Sharon Marie Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, and the wife of film director Roman Polanski. Her friend and former lover, 35-year-old Jay Sebring, a noted celebrity hairstylist, Polanski's friend, 32-year-old Wojciech Frykowski, and Frykowski's 25-year-old girlfriend, Abigail Ann Folger, heiress to the Folgers' coffee fortune and daughter of Peter Folger. Also present on the property were 19-year-old William Garrettson, the caretaker, and his friend, 18-year-old Stephen Earl Parent. Polanski was in Europe working on a film. Music producer Quincy Jones was a friend of Sebring who had planned to join him that evening, but did not go. Watson and the three women arrived at Celio Drive just past midnight on August 9th, 1969. Watson climbed a telephone pole near the entrance gate and cut the phone line to the house. The group backed their car to the bottom of the hill that led to the estate and walked back up to the house. They thought that the gate might be electrified or equipped with an alarm, so they climbed a brushy embankment to the right of the gate and entered the grounds. Headlights approached them from within the property, and Watson ordered the women to lie down in the bushes. He stepped out and ordered the approaching driver to halt. Stephen Parent had been visiting the property's caretaker, William Garrettson, who lived in the guest house. Watson leveled a .22 caliber revolver at Parent, who begged him not to hurt him, claiming that he would not say anything. Watson then lunged at him with a knife, giving him a defensive slash wound on the palm of his hand that severed tendons and tore the boy's watch off of his wrist, then shot him 4 times in the chest and abdomen, killing him in the front seat of his white 1965 AMC Ambassador coupe. Watson then ordered the women to help push the car up the driveway. Watson next cut the screen of a window, then told Casbian to keep watch down by the gate. She walked over to Parent's car and waited. Watson removed the screen, entered through the window, and let Atkins and Krenwinkel in through the front door. He whispered to Atkins and awoke Frykowski, who was sleeping on the living room couch. Watson kicked him in the head, and Frykowski asked him who he was and what he was doing there. Watson replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." On Watson's direction, Atkins found the house's 3 other occupants with Krenwinkel's help and forced them to the living room. Watson began to tie Tate and Sebring together by their necks with a long nylon rope which he had brought, then slung it over one of the living room's ceiling beams. Sebring protested the murderer's rough treatment of the pregnant Tate, so Watson shot him. Folger was taken momentarily back to her bedroom for her purse, and she gave the murderer $70. Watson then stabbed Sebring 7 times. Frykowski's hands had been bound with a towel, but he freed himself and began struggling with Atkins, who stabbed at his legs with a knife. He fought his way out the front door and onto the porch, but Watson caught up with him, struck him over the head with the gun multiple times, stabbed him repeatedly, and shot him twice. Casbian had heard, quote, horrifying sounds and moved toward the house from her position in the driveway. She told Atkins that someone was coming in an attempt to stop the murders. Inside the house, Folger escaped from Krenwinkel and fled out a bedroom door to the pool area. Krenwinkel pursued her and caught her on the front lawn, where she stabbed her and tackled her to the ground. Watson then helped kill her. Her assailants stabbed her a total of 28 times. Frykowski struggled across the lawn, but Watson continued to stab him, killing him. Frykowski suffered 51 stab wounds and also been struck 13 times in the head with the butt of Watson's gun, which bent the barrel and broke off one side of the gun grip, which was recovered at the scene. Inside the house, Tate pled to be allowed to live long enough to give birth, and offered herself as a hostage in an attempt to save the life of her unborn child. But both Atkins and Watson stabbed Tate 16 times, killing her. The coroner's report found that Tate was still alive when she was hanged with the nylon rope, although the cause of her death was determined as a massive hemorrhage, while in Sebring's murder, it was found that he was hanged lifeless. According to Watson, Manson had told the women to, quote, leave a sign, something witchy. Atkins wrote pig on the front door in Tate's blood. Atkins claims she did this to copycat the murder scene of Gary Hinman in order to get Manson family member Bobby Bosoli out of jail, who was in custody for the murder. Bosoli wrote political piggy in Hinman's blood on his wall after stabbing him to death. Tex Watson became involved in drug dealing and robbed a 22-year-old drug dealer named Bernard Crow. Crow allegedly responded with a threat to kill everyone at Spawn Ranch. In response, Manson shot Crow on July 1st, 1969, at Manson's Hollywood apartment. Manson's belief that he had killed Crow was seemingly confirmed by a news report of the discovery of the dumped body of a Black Panther in Los Angeles. Although Crow was not a member of the Black Panthers, Manson concluded that he had been and expected retaliation from the Panthers. He turned Spawn Ranch into a defensive camp, establishing night patrols by armed guards. Watson would later write, Blackie was trying to get at the chosen ones. Manson brought in members of the Straight Satan's motorcycle club to act as security. The 4 murderers plus Manson, Leslie Van Houten, and Clem Grogan went for a drive the following night. Manson was allegedly displeased with the previous night's murders, so he told Caspian to drive to a house on Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz section of Los Angeles, located next door to a home where Manson and family members had attended a party the previous year. It belonged to 44-year-old supermarket executive Lino LaBianca and his 43-year-old wife, Rosemary, co-owner of a dress shop. According to Atkins and Caspian, Manson disappeared up the driveway and returned to say that he had tied up the house's occupants. Then Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten went in. Watson claims in his autobiography that Manson went up alone, then returned to take him up to the house with him. Manson pointed out a sleeping man through a window, and the two entered through the unlocked back door. Watson claims Manson roused the sleeping Lino LaBianca from the couch at gunpoint and had Watson bind his hands with a leather thong. Rosemary was brought into the living room from the bedroom, and Watson covered the couple's heads with pillowcases, which he bound in place with lamp cords. Manson left, and Krenwinkel and Van Houten entered the house. Watson had complained to Manson earlier of the inadequacy of the previous night's weapons. Watson sent the woman from the kitchen to the bedroom, where Rosemary had been returned, while he went to the living room and began stabbing Lino with a chrome-plated bayonet. The first thrust went into his throat. Watson heard a scuffle in the bedroom and went in there to discover Rosemary keeping the woman at bay by swinging the lamp tied to her neck. He stabbed her several times with the bayonet, then returned to the living room and resumed attacking Lino, whom he stabbed a total of 12 times. He then carved the word "war" into his abdomen. Watson returned to the bedroom and found Krenwinkel stabbing Rosemary with a knife from the kitchen. Van Houten stabbed her approximately 16 times in the back and the exposed butt. Van Houten claimed at trial that Rosemary was already dead during the stabbing. Evidence showed that many of the 41 stab wounds had, in fact, been inflicted post-mortem. Watson then cleaned off the bayonet and showered, while Krenwinkel wrote "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls and "Helter Skelter" on the refrigerator door, all in LaBianca's blood. She gave Lino 14 puncture wounds with an ivory-handled, two-tined carving fork, which she left jutting out of his stomach. She also planted a steak knife into his throat. Meanwhile, Manson drove the other 3 family members, who had departed Spawn with him that evening, to the Venice home of the Lebanese actor Saladin Nader. Manson left them there and drove back to Spawn Ranch, leaving them and the LaBianca killers to hitchhike home. According to Caspian, Manson wanted his followers to murder Nader in his apartment, but Caspian claims she thwarted the murder by deliberately knocking on the wrong apartment door and waking a stranger. The group abandoned the murder plan and left, but Atkins defected in the stairwell on the way out. 35-year-old Hollywood stuntman Donald Jerome Shea was murdered on August 26, 1969, more than 2 weeks after the Tate LaBianca murders, when Manson told Shea, Bruce Davis, Tex Watson, and Steve Grogan to go on a ride to a nearby car parts yard on the Spawn Ranch. According to Davis, he sat in the back seat with Grogan, who then hit Shea with a pipe wrench, and Watson stabbed him. They brought Shea down a hill behind the ranch and stabbed and brutally tortured him to death. Bruce Davis recalled at his parole hearings, "I was in the car when Steve Grogan hit Shorty with the pipe wrench. Charles Watson stabbed him. I was in the back seat with Grogan. They took Shorty out. They had to go down the hill to a place. I stayed in the car for quite a while, then I went down the hill later on, and that's when I cut Shorty on the shoulder with the knife. after he was, well, I don't know. I don't know if he was dead or not. He didn't bleed when I cut him on the shoulder. When I showed up, he was incapacitated. I don't know if... You asked if he was unconscious. I don't know. He may or may not have been. He didn't seem conscious. He wasn't moving or saying anything. And it started off, Manson handed me a machete as if I was supposed to... I know what he wanted, but, I couldn't do that. And in fact, I did touch Shorty Shea with a machete on the back of his neck. I didn't break the skin. I just couldn't do it. And then I threw the knife. And he handed me a bayonet, and I just reached over and I don't know which side it was on, but I cut him right about here on the shoulder, just with the tip of the blade. Sort of like saying, "Are you satisfied, Charlie?" And I turned around and walked away. And I was sick for about 2 or 3 days. I couldn't even think about what I had done. In December 1977, Shea's skeletal remains were discovered on a nondescript hillside near Santa Susana Road next to Spawn Ranch after Grogan, one of those convicted of the murder, agreed to aid authorities in the recovery of Shea's body by drawing a map to its location. According to the autopsy report, his body suffered multiple stab and chopping wounds to the chest and blunt force trauma to the head. In total, Manson and his followers were convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder. However, the LAPD believes that the family could have claimed up to at least 12 more victims. Cliff Shepard, a former LAPD Robbery Homicide Division detective, said that Manson repeatedly claimed to have killed many others. Prosecutor Stephen Cray supported this assertion. I know that Manson one time told one of his cellmates that he was responsible for 35 murders. Tate's younger sister, Deborah Tate, had also claimed that investigators are, quote, just scraping the surface when it comes to the number of Manson's victims, and has further elaborated on how Manson sent her a taunting map of the Panamint Range with crosses on it that she believed were meant to represent buried bodies. This has resulted in several excavations that have been undertaken at Manson's Barker Ranch, but they have not resulted in any bodies being found. The Tate murders became national news on August 9, 1969, after the Polanski's housekeeper, Winifred Chapman, arrived for work that morning. On August 10th, detectives of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction in the Hinneman case, informed LAPD detectives assigned to the Tate case of the bloody writing at the Hinneman house. According to Vincent Buglisi, I'm always going to butcher that name, because detectives believed the Tate murders were a consequence of a drug transaction. The Tate team initially ignored this and other evidence of similarities between the crimes. During the Tate autopsies, detectives working on the Hinneman case noticed similarities in the weapons used, the stab wounds, and the writing and blood on the walls. They brought the information to detectives working on the Tate murders. According to Detective Charlie Gunther, Vince Buglisi didn't want anything to do with the Hinneman case. Hinneman was a nothing case. Vince didn't want to prosecute it. Held briefly as a Tate suspect, Gerritsen told police he had neither seen nor heard anything on the murder night. He was released on August 11, 1969, after undergoing a polygraph examination that indicated that he had not been involved in the crimes. The La Bianca crime scene was discovered at 10:30 p.m. on August 10th, approximately 19 hours after the murders were committed, when 15-year-old Frank Struthers, Rosemary's son from a prior marriage and Leno's stepson, returned from a camping trip. On August 12, 1969, the LAPD told the press it had ruled out any connection between the Tate and LaBianca murders. On August 16th, the sheriff's office raided Spahn Ranch and arrested Manson and 25 others as suspects in a major auto theft ring that had been stealing Volkswagen Beetles and converting them into dune buggies. Weapons were seized, but because a search warrant had been misstated, the group was released a few days later. In a report at the end of August, the LaBianca detectives noted a possible connection between the bloody writings at the LaBianca house and the singing group The Beatles' most recent album. Still working separately from the Tate team, the LaBianca team checked with the sheriff's office in mid-October about possible similar crimes. They learned of the Hinman case and also learned that the Hinman detectives had spoken with Boselli's girlfriend, Kitty Lutzinger. She had been arrested a few days earlier with members of the Manson family. The arrests for car theft had taken place at the desert ranches to which the family had moved. A joint force of National Park Service rangers and officers from the California Highway Patrol and the Inyo County Sheriff's Office, federal, state, and county personnel had raided both the Myers and Barker ranches after following evidence left when family members had burned an earth mover owned by Death Valley National Monument. The raiders had found stolen dune buggies and other vehicles and arrested 24 people, including Manson. A highway patrol officer found Manson hiding in a cabinet beneath Barker's bathroom sink. Following up leads a month after they had spoken with Lutzinger, LaBianca detectives contacted members of a motorcycle gang Manson tried to recruit as bodyguards while the family was at Spahn Ranch. Meanwhile, a dormitory mate of Susan Atkins informed the LAPD of the family's involvement in the crimes. Atkins was booked for the Hinman murder after she told sheriff's detectives that she had been involved in it. Transferred to Sybil Brand Institute, a detention center in Monterey Park, California, she had begun talking to bunkmates, Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham, to whom she gave accounts of the events in which she had been involved. On December 1st, 1969, LAPD announced warrants for the arrests of Watson, Krenwinkel, and Casbian in the Tate case. The suspects' involvement in the LaBianca murders was noted. Manson and Atkins, already in custody, were not mentioned. The connection between the LaBianca case and the Van Houten, who was also among those arrested near Death Valley, had not yet been recognized. Watson and Krenwinkel were already under arrest, with authorities in McKinney, Texas, and Mobile, Alabama having picked them up on notice from LAPD. Informed that a warrant was out for her arrest, Casbian voluntarily surrendered to authorities in Concord, New Hampshire on December 2nd. Physical evidence such as Krenwinkel's and Watson's fingerprints, which had been collected by LAPD at Celio Drive, and photographs between 340 and 41 was augmented by evidence recovered by the public. On September 1st, 1969, the distinctive .22 caliber high-standard buntline special revolver Watson used on Parent, Sebring, and Frykowski had been found and given to the police by Stephen Wise, a 10-year-old who lived near the Tate residence. In mid-December, when the Los Angeles Times published a crime account based on information Susan Atkins had given her attorney, Weiss's father made several phone calls which finally prompted the LAPD to locate the gun in its evidence file and connect it with the murder via ballistic tests. Acting on that same newspaper account, a local ABC television crew quickly located and recovered the bloody clothing discarded by the Tate killers. The knives discarded en route from the Tate residence were never recovered, despite a search by some of the same crewmen and by LAPD. A knife found behind the cushion of a chair in the Tate living room was apparently that of Susan Atkins, who lost her knife in the course of the attack. The trial began on June 15, 1970. The prosecution's main witness was Casbian, who, along with Manson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel, had been charged with 7 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Since Casbian, by all accounts, had not participated in the killings, she was granted immunity in exchange for testimony that detailed the nights of the crimes. Originally, a deal had been made with Atkins, in which the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty against her in exchange for her grand jury testimony, on which the indictments were secured. Once Atkins repudiated that testimony, the deal was withdrawn. Because Van Houten had participated only in the La Bianca killings, she was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Originally, Judge William Keene had reluctantly granted Manson permission to act as his own attorney. Because of Manson's conduct, including violations of a gag order and submission of outlandish and nonsensical pretrial motions, the permission was withdrawn before the trial start. Manson filed an affidavit of prejudice against Keene, who was replaced by Judge Charles Older. On Friday, July 24th, the first day of testimony, Manson appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead. He issued a statement that he was considered inadequate and incompetent to speak or defend himself, and had X'd himself from the establishment's world. Over the following weekend, the female defendants duplicated the mark on their own foreheads, as did most family members within another day or so. The prosecution argued the triggering of Helter Skelter was Manson's main motive. The crime scene's Bloody White album reference Helter Skelter, written by Susan Atkins, and the writing of Pigs was correlated with testimony about Manson's predictions that the murders black people would commit at the onset of Helter Skelter would involve the writings of pigs on the walls in victims' blood. The defendants testified that the writing in blood on the walls was to copy that of the Hinman murder scene, not an apocalyptic race war. According to Buglowski, Manson directed Casbian to hide a wallet taken from the scene in the woman's restroom of a service station near a black neighborhood. However, as co-prosecutor Stephen K. later pointed out, the wallet was actually left about 20 miles away in a predominantly white neighborhood. During the trial, family members loitered near the entrances and corridors of the courthouse. To keep them out of the courtroom proper, the prosecution subpoenaed them as prospective witnesses who would not be able to enter while others were testifying. When the group established itself in vigil on the sidewalk, some members wore sheathed hunting knives that, although in plain view, were carried legally. Each of them was also identifiable by the X on their forehead. Some family members attempted to dissuade witnesses from testifying. Prosecution witnesses Paul Watkins and Juan Flynn were both threatened. Watkins was badly burned in a suspicious fire in his van. Former family member Barbara Hoyt, who had overheard Susan Atkins describing the Tate murders to family member Ruth Ann Morehouse, agreed to accompany the latter to Hawaii. There, Morehouse allegedly gave her a hamburger spiked with several doses of LSD. Found sprawled on a Honolulu curb in a drugged semi-stupor, Hoyt was taken to the hospital, where she did her best to identify herself as a witness in the Tate La Bianca murder trial. Before the incident, Hoyt had been a reluctant witness. After the attempt to silence her, her reticence disappeared. On August 4th, despite precautions taken by the court, Manson flashed the jury a Los Angeles Times front page whose headline was, "Manson Guilty, Nixon Declares." This was a reference to a statement made the previous day when U.S. President Richard Nixon had decreed what he saw as the media's glamorization of Manson. Voirdired by Judge Charles Older, the jurors contended that the headline had not influenced them. The next day, the female defendant stood up and said in unison that, in light of Nixon's remark, there was no point in going on with the trial. On October 5th, Manson was denied the court's permission to question a prosecution witness whom defense attorneys had declined to cross-examine. Leaping over the defense table, Manson attempted to attack the judge. Wrestled to the ground by bailiffs, he was removed from the courtroom with the female defendants, who had subsequently risen and began chanting in Latin. Thereafter, Older allegedly began wearing a revolver under his robes. On November 16th, the prosecution rested its case. 3 days later, after arguing standard dismissal motions, the defense stunned the court by resting as well, without calling a single witness. Shouting their disapproval, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten demanded their right to testify. In chambers, the women's lawyers told the judge their clients wanted to testify that they had planned and committed the crimes, and that Manson had not been involved. By resting their case, the defense lawyers had tried to stop this. Van Houten's attorney, Ronald Hughes, vehemently stated that he would not push a client out the window. In the prosecutor's view, it was Manson who was advising the women to testify in this way as a means of saving himself. Speaking about the trial in a 1987 documentary, Krenwinkel said, "The entire proceedings were scripted by Charlie." The next day, Manson testified. The jury was removed from the courtroom. According to Vincent Bugliosi, it was to make sure Manson's dress did not violate the California Supreme Court's decision in The People vs. Ornata by making statements implicating his co-defendants. However, Bugliosi argued Manson would use his hypnotic powers to unfairly influence a jury. Speaking for more than an hour, Manson said, among other things, that, quote, "the music is telling the youth to rise up against the establishment." He said, "Why blame it on me? I didn't write the music." To be honest with you, Manson also stated, "I don't recall ever saying, get a knife and change of clothes and go do what text says." As the body of the trial concluded, and with the closing arguments impending, defense attorney Hughes disappeared during a weekend trip. When Maxwell Keith was appointed to represent Van Houten in Hughes' absence, a delay of more than 2 weeks was required to permit Keith to familiarize himself with the voluminous trial transcripts. No sooner had the trial resumed, just before Christmas, than disruptions of the prosecution's closing argument by the defendants led Older to ban the 4 defendants from the courtroom for the remainder of the guilt phase. This may have occurred because the defendants were acting in collusion with each other and were simply putting on a performance, which Older said was becoming obvious. On January 25, 1971, the jury returned guilty verdicts against the 4 defendants on each of the 27 separate counts against them. Not far into the trial's penalty phase, the jurors saw the defense that Manson, in the prosecution's view, had planned to present. Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten testified the murders had been conceived as, quote, copycat versions of the Hinman murder, for which Atkins now took credit. The killings, they said, were intended to draw suspicion away from Bobby Bossellini by resembling the crime for which he had been jailed. This plan had supposedly been the work of and carried out under the guidance of not Manson, but someone allegedly in love with Boselli, Linda Casbian. Among the narrative's weak points was the inability of Atkins to explain why, as she was maintaining she had written Political Piggy at the Hinman house in the first place. Midway through the penalty phase, Manson shaved his head and trimmed his beard to a fork. He told the press, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." In what the prosecution regarded as belated recognition on their part that imitation of Manson only proved his domination, the female defendants refrained from shaving their heads until the jurors retired to weigh the state's request for the death penalty. On March 29, 1971, the jury returned verdicts of death against all 4 defendants on all counts. On April 19, 1971, Judge Older sentenced the 4 to death. Manson was admitted to state prison from Los Angeles County on April 22, 1971, for 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Earl Parent, Sharon Tate Polanski, Jay Sebring, and Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. As the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional in 1972, Manson was resentenced to life with the possibility of parole. His initial death sentence was modified to life on February 2, 1977. On December 13, 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder in Los Angeles County Court for the July 25th death of musician Gary Hinman. He was also convicted of first-degree murder for the August 1969 death of Donald Shea. Following the 1972 decision of California v. Anderson, California's death sentences were ruled unconstitutional, and that any prisoner now under a sentence of death may file a petition for writ of habeas corpus in the Superior Court, inviting that court to modify its judgment to provide for the appropriate alternative punishment of life imprisonment or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, specified by statute for the crime for which he was sentenced to death. Manson was thus eligible to apply for parole after 7 years incarceration. His first parole hearing took place on November 16, 1978, at California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where his petition was rejected. On September 5, 1975, the family returned to national attention when Squeaky Fromme attempted to assassinate U.S. President Gerald Ford. The attempt took place in Sacramento, to which she and fellow Manson follower Sandra Good had moved so that they could be near Manson while he was incarcerated at Folsom State Prison. A subsequent search of the apartment shared by Fromme, Good, and other family recruit turned up evidence that, coupled with later actions on the part of Good, resulted in Good's conviction for conspiring to send threatening communications through the United States Mail Service and for transmitting death threats by way of interstate commerce. The threats involved corporate executives and U.S. government officials' supposed environmental dereliction on their part. Fromme was sentenced to 15 years to life, becoming the first person sentenced under United States Code Title 18, Chapter 84, which made it a federal crime to attempt to assassinate the President of the United States. I'm surprised it wasn't a federal crime before that. You'd think that would have been. In December of 1987, Fromme, serving a life sentence for the assassination attempt, escaped briefly from federal prison, Camp Alderson in West Virginia. She was trying to reach Manson because she heard that he had testicular cancer. She was apprehended within days. She was released on parole from Federal Medical Center, Carswell, on August 14, 2009. On April 11, 2012, Manson was denied release at his 12th parole hearing, which he did not attend. After his March 27, 1997 parole hearing, Manson refused to attend any of his later hearings. The panel at that hearing noted that Manson had a history of controlling behavior and mental health issues, including schizophrenia and paranoid delusional disorder, and was too great a danger to be released. The panel also noted that Manson had received 108 rules violations reports, had no indication of remorse, no insight into the causative factors of the crimes, lacked understanding of the magnitude of the crimes, had an exceptional, callous disregard for human suffering, and had no parole plans. At the April 11, 2012 parole hearing, it was determined that Manson would not be reconsidered for parole for another 15 years, not before 2027, at which time he would have been 92 years old. According to a recent reanalysis of Manson's psychological state, researchers suggest that he may have been misdiagnosed with schizophrenia. Instead, they propose that Manson had bipolar disorder and psychopathy. On January 1, 2017, Manson was being held at Corcoran Prison when he was rushed to Mercy Hospital in downtown Bakersfield because he had gastrointestinal bleeding. A source told the Los Angeles Times that Manson was very ill, and TMZ reported that his doctors considered him too weak for surgery that normally would be performed in cases such as his. He was returned to prison on January 6th, and the nature of his treatment was not disclosed. On November 15, 2017, an unauthorized source said that Manson had returned to a hospital in Bakersfield, but the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation did not confirm this with state and federal medical privacy laws. He died from cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure brought on by colon cancer at the hospital on November 19th. 3 people stated their intention to claim Manson's estate and body. Manson's grandson, Jason Freeman, stated his intent to take possession of Manson's remains and personal effects. Manson's pen pal, Michael Channels, claimed to have a Manson will dated February 14, 2002, which left Manson's entire estate and Manson's body to Channels. Manson's friend, Ben Gurecki, claimed to have a Manson will dated January 2017, which gives the estate and Manson's body to Matthew Roberts, another alleged son of Manson. In 2012, CNN ran a DNA match to see if Freeman and Roberts were related to each other, and found that they were not. According to CNN, 2 prior attempts to DNA match Roberts with genetic material from Manson failed, but the results were reportedly contaminated. On March 12, 2018, the Kern County Superior Court in California decided in favor of Freeman in regard to Manson's body. Freeman had Manson cremated on March 20th, 2018. Well, that is going to do it for this week's episode. I hope that everyone enjoyed this story. If you could you please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts? A 5-star rating really helps others to find the show. Don't forget to join us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe on YouTube. Once again, thank you everyone for listening over the last 2 years, and here's to many more to come. And make sure to keep your doors and windows locked, and stay ready for Ohio Unsolved.